I was chatting with Claudia Malier a few weeks ago about this sermon, and I mentioned that Julia Ward Howe's intent for Mother's Day was not about flowers and chocolate and breakfast in bed, but about peace. And without a beat, Claudia quipped, "Well, chocolate and breakfast in bed can create peace too, you know." So I'm going to start with a disclaimer that my intent with this sermon is not to suggest that we stop celebrating mothers with gifts and cards and flowers, but to expand the possibilities of how we might make meaning out of Mother's Day. Julia Ward Howe was a writer, a poet, a musician. She was a singer, a suffragette, an abolitionist, a feminist, and a pacifist. She had 6 children, learned 6 languages, and published 6 books. She was well-traveled and a prominent figure in the intellectual societies of Boston. She founded and co-led the Association of American Women and co-founded the American Woman Suffrage Association. She was the first woman to be inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And her friends included Theodore Parker, a Unitarian minister who baptized her first child, Florence Nightingale, who was the godmother of one of her daughters, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Horace and Lucy Mann, Lucy Stone, and many others. Julia Ward was born in 1819, just 3 days after Queen Victoria, and sometimes Julia was referred to as the Queen of America. Her mother died when she was only 5, and her father became very protective of the children. He was a strict Calvinist, but nevertheless, he saw to it that she was tutored at home and in private schools where she learned languages and had music lessons, voice training. She read literature and history and philosophy and continued that throughout her life. And by age 20, her literary criticism had been published anonymously in the Literary and Theological Review and in the New York Review. Following the death of her father in 1939, Julia began to question her faith and her Calvinist upbringing. And in addition to the liberal ideas that she encountered through her reading, on a trip to Boston to visit a friend, she heard William Ellery Channing speak, heard a lecture by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and had a chance to have a conversation with Margaret Fuller. Later she wrote, "I studied my way out of all the mental agonies which Calvinism can engender and became a Unitarian." Julia was a vibrant young woman, beautiful. She had auburn hair and blue eyes and a quick wit to match. And on the same visit to Boston, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Charles Sumner took her to the Perkins School for the Blind, where she met her future husband, Samuel Gridley Howe, who was a doctor and a director of that institution. They were strongly attracted to each other and decided to marry, even though they both expressed misgivings before the marriage. Samuel wanted a wife to support him in his work and rather doubted whether a talented socialite was equal to the task. Julia's misgivings were that she recognized Samuel was serious and wholly focused to his work, while she was brilliant and witty and loved literature, music, and the social scene. But marry they did, and not surprisingly, it was a troubled marriage. Samuel was 18 years her senior and referred to her as a child, expecting her to relinquish all of her outside pursuits to fulfill the roles of wife and mother, unlike many other women. He took control of her inheritance, mismanaged it, and lost most of it. And Julia suffered from isolation and loneliness as Samuel was involved in his work and spent more time with his friends than with her. She was stuck at home with her young children and no social and intellectual outlets, and wrote, "My books are all that keep me alive." Several years after their marriage, when Julia anonymously published a book of poems entitled Passion Flowers without her husband's permission, Samuel was incensed. Some of the poems alluded to their terrible marriage, and it wasn't long before her authorship was an open secret. Julia wrote, "I have never known my husband to approve any act of mine which I myself valued." Samuel was so intent upon controlling her that he even went so far as to threaten to put their sixth child up for adoption if she didn't behave. But despite his failings in the marriage, Samuel Howe did have his redeeming qualities. As an educator at the Perkins School for the Blind, he was known for teaching the alphabet to Laura Bridgman, a student who was blind and deaf. This was prior to Helen Keller. He also championed the improvement of public schools, prison reform, oral communication and lip reading for the deaf, and humane treatment for the mentally ill. In the 1850s, Samuel and Julia were drawn into William Lord Garrison's anti-slavery group by Unitarian minister Theodore Parker. In 1856, Samuel Howe led anti-slavery settlers to Kansas in a series of confrontations you may know as Bloody Kansas. And he was also one of the Secret Six who funded John Brown's 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry, which was to incite a slave rebellion. Samuel Howe must have loosened his tight control on Julia by that time, because during that period he allowed her to write for the abolitionist paper The Commonwealth, which he edited. When the Civil War broke out, Samuel used his skills as a doctor by working for the Sanitary Commission, which was a precursor to today's American Red Cross. And in November of 1861, he and Julia went to Washington to visit the Union camps and hospitals to check on the sanitary conditions there. While they were there, the two of them went to watch a Union Army review, which was suddenly dispersed by a Confederate attack. And on the way back to the city, their carriage was surrounded by the retreating troops. And so the Howe party began to sing patriotic songs, including the popular John Brown's Body, which went like this. John Brown's body lay a-mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lie a-mouldering in the grave. His soul is marching on. Sound familiar? James Freeman Clark, a Unitarian minister who was in the party, suggested to Julia that she write new words and better lyrics for that tune, and at the hotel late that night, she penned the words to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And it quickly became one of the most popular songs of the Union during the American Civil War. When I recall singing this hymn in the Southern Baptist Church of my youth, I mostly recall the disturbing Old Testament images of a vengeful God. However, I did not realize the allusion to abolition of slavery that was found in verse 4, which goes like this. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea. With a glory in his bosom, he transfigured you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. Writing the Battle Hymn of the Republic was a turning point in Julia's life. Its publication put her in the public eye, and she came into her own. And it seems that by 1868, her husband no longer opposed her involvement in public life. Julia held numerous speaking engagements and became quite active in civic life. She worked tirelessly for suffrage, establishing the American Woman Suffrage Association with co-leader Lucy Stone. And she also advocated for gender equality, and in 1874 published a book entitled Sex and Education, which advocated for the co-education of women and men. In 1875, she began hosting conventions of women ministers in conjunction with the annual meeting of the Unitarian denomination, although she never sought ordination for herself. And at the 1893 Parliament of World Religions held in Chicago, she gave an address entitled, "What is Religion?" saying there, "I think nothing is religion which puts one individual absolutely above others, and surely nothing is religion which puts one sex above another." Julia's feminist conviction that women had a responsibility to shape their societies at a political level was also seen in her Appeal to Womanhood, which she wrote in 1870, responding to the cruelties of the Franco-Prussian War. And she relates this: "I was visited by a sudden feeling of the cruel and unnecessary character of the contest. It seemed to me a return to barbarism, the issue having been one which might easily have been settled without bloodshed. The question forced itself upon me: why do not the mothers of mankind interfere in these matters, to prevent the waste of that human life of which they alone bear and know the cost? I'd never thought of this before. The august dignity of motherhood and its terrible responsibilities now appeared to me in a new aspect. And I could think of no better way of expressing my sense of these than that of sending forth an appeal to womanhood throughout the world, which I then and there composed. The little document which I drew up in the heat of my enthusiasm implored women all the world over to awake to the knowledge of the sacred right vested in them as mothers, to protect the human life which cost them so many pangs." The Appeal to Womanhood was later renamed the Mother's Day Proclamation. Listen now to the words that Julia Ward Howe penned.
Arise then, women of this day.
Arise, all women who have hearts, whether our baptism be of water or of tears.
Say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies.
Our husbands will not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause.
Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience.
We, the women of one country, will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs.
From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm.
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 The sword of murder is not the balance of justice.
Blood does not wipe out dishonor, nor violence indicate possession.
As men have forsaken the plow and plow at the summons of war,
Let women now leave all that may be left at home for a great and earnest day of counsel.
Let them meet first as women to bewail and commemorate the dead.
Let them solemnly take counsel with each other as to the means whereby the great human family can live in peace.
Each bearing after his own time the sacred impress, nothing of Caesar but God.
in the name of womanhood and humanity, I earnestly ask that a general Congress of women without limit of nationality may be appointed and held at some place deemed most covenant.
And at the earliest period consistent with its objects.
To
amicable settlement of international questions,
the great and general interest of peace.
In 1872, Julia went to London to promote an International Women's Peace Congress, but was not able to bring it off. Back in Boston, she initiated Mother's Peace Day observant on June 2nd, and it was held there for a number of years. Her idea spread, but was later replaced by the Mother's Day holiday we now celebrate in May. Nevertheless, Julia Ward Howe, abolitionist and pacifist, continued championing other causes. In particular, she advocated for women's suffrage and coeducation of women and men. However, Julia Ward Howe was one of only many women who were engaged in social activism in the 19th century. Historian Ruth Rosen notes that these 19th century women believed that they bore a special responsibility as actual or potential mothers to care for the casualties of society and to turn America into a more civilized nation. They played leading roles in the abolitionist movement, launched successful campaigns against lynching and consumer fraud, and battled for improved working conditions for women and protection for children, for public health services and social welfare assistance to the poor. To them, the connection between motherhood and the fight for social and economic justice seemed self-evident. So it's fitting that today, Mother's Day, is the launch of the Poor People's Campaign that plans 40 days of nonviolent, moral, direct action. Chris and I and a couple of other ministers in town will be traveling to Nashville, and some of you may be attending as well, to participate in this action. This revival of the Poor People's Campaign is a revival of the one that Martin Luther King Jr. started in 1968, and which this church supported as it traveled through Knoxville. The purpose of this campaign is to force a serious national examination of the enmeshed evils, the triple evils that Martin Luther King Jr. expressed of racism, poverty, and militarism, and adding to that ecological devastation. As Ruth Rosen points out, Americans may revere the idea of motherhood and love their own mothers, but not all mothers. Poor, unemployed mothers may enjoy flowers, but they also need child care, job training, health care, a higher minimum wage, and parental leave. Working mothers may enjoy breakfast in bed, but they also need the kind of governmental assistance provided by other industrialized nations. So I ask you to imagine a Mother's Day filled not only with cards and flowers and breakfast in bed, but a day filled with voices demanding social and economic justice and a sustainable future. 19th century women dared to dream of a day that honored women's civil activism. We can do no less. We should honor the vision of women like Julia Ward Howe with civic activism of our own.